What is your favorite film roll packaging? Because honestly, for me it is pretty clear, 100 film. We already talked about and characterized the color of 100 film in the first episode of Color Science in 35mm. That one and 12 other emulsions. But last year, 2 new rolls appeared under this same label, 400 and 800 film. So why not dedicate a mini episode to the color of this whole film family? What defines them? In which photographic genres do they shine? We are also going to talk about the original emulsion they are based on, and I will show you some of my best photos shot with each of these rolls. The graphs I'm showing you are just like in the original video, direct representation of the numerical data extracted from each analysis of the film. The protocol is clearly defined and follows these steps. Capture, using a calibrated color checker. Development, in this case sponsored by Carmencita Film Lab. Scanning, inversion and normalization, and data extraction. Does this mean that the colors I am showing are the only colors this film can produce? No, definitely not. But this is the only way I have found to compare them without adding extra points of subjectivity. In short, the graphs are objective even if they may contain experimental error. My evaluation are always subjective interpretations. Let us start with the 100 film, one of my favorite rolls and probably the most distinctive film in this family. Its most recognizable feature is the way it renders violets, magentas and pinkish tones, colors that many feel tend to desaturate or shift, but that here appear especially rich and alive. In exchange, yellows and orange lose saturation and move toward more reddish or pinkish tones. This directly affects skin, which takes on a less orange and more softly red-pinked complexion. The greens also have a lot of character. The purer ones shift toward more washed out cyan-leaning variation, creating a clear separation from the more yellowish greens. In vegetation, this can create a very attractive palette. Overall, 100 builds its color scheme around complementary colors, reds and pinks on the one side, washed out blues and greens on the other. It is not a neutral film, but it's a very recognizable one. I will use it mainly for landscape photography, where plants diversity plays a central role, and for scenes where I want the film itself to have a clear voice. Let us continue with 400 film, which is probably the most balanced film in this family. Compared with the stronger character of 100 film, here we find a more stable, more restrained emulsion, with a fairly faithful color rendering. In terms of hue, it does not show any major shift, apart from a slightly tendency for reds to move toward orange. Saturation also stays very controlled. Yellows and blues rise slightly, while greens drop a little, but without throwing the overall balance off. In real photograph, this translates into dense natural images without any major chromatic oddities. I find it especially interesting in yellows, orange and reds, where it preserves hue very well and can bring a very pleasant warmth. Some of these colors even increase in saturation, which also make it particularly interesting for golden hour photography. It also has notably fine grain for a 400 ISO film, and here we get a first important clue. It can also show halation. We will come back to this later, because it's not a coincidence. It is the option I will choose when I want beautiful color with a certain amount of personality, but without the film imposing itself too much on the scene. Finally, we have 800 film, a film with a color pattern that is very different from the rest of the emulsions, and in that sense, quite unique. Its color is heavily conditioned by its suntan balance, and that is especially noticeable in the way it cools down the scene. The greens, from the more yellowish ones to the purest ones, shift towards cyans. The blues also tend to cluster around the same region, but with an important difference. While greens and yellows lose saturations, blues usually gain it. In real photographs, this creates a very particular palette. Less warm greens, cooler shadows, more present blues, and an overall atmosphere that feels more cyanotic and ethereal. It is a film that does not try to represent the scene neutrally, but to transform it. And still, it preserves the hue of yellows, orange and reds quite well. Not necessarily the saturation, but the hue. That is why skin rendering remains surprisingly good despite such a strong character. For all these reasons, I will reserve it for situations where I want the film to carry clear aesthetic weight: artificial light, night, interiors, urban scenes, or any context where that coolness and the possible appearance of halation add something to the image. It would not be my first choice for neutral color or natural greens, but it will be a very good option for building atmosphere. Although the grain is more visible than in 400, it is still quite light for an 800 ISO film. So once we have seen how they behave, it is time to answer the other big question: what emotions are behind 100, 400 and 800 film? As many of you already pointed out in the previous video, 100 corresponds to Kodak Aerocolor 4, not to be confused with Aerochrome. Aerocolor is a film originally created for aerial photography, so for system mounted on aircraft to document topography, geography, vegetation surfaces. That is why Kodak does not sell it as a standard 35mm roll film, but in large bulk rolls. Companies like 100 Film are the ones that rewind it into classic 135 cassette for general public, and for that I think we should be thankful. With 400 and 800, the answer is simpler, because both of them have an edge code that gives away their origin. On 400 we can read Eastman, which already tells us that the producer is once again Kodak, and then we find the code 5207, which corresponds to Kodak Vision 250D. On 800, Eastman appears again, but in this case the code is 5219, which corresponds to Kodak Vision 3 500T. In other words, 400 and 800 come from Kodak Vision 3, Kodak's motion picture film series, the one that is still used for cinema projection and large screen production. And this is where the famous remjet layers comes in. These motion picture films were not originally designed to be processed using standard C41 chemistry, partly because they include a protected layer known as remjet. This layer helps protect the film base inside cinema cameras and also prevents halation. When some companies remove this layer in order to rewind the film and process it in C41, two very visible consequences appear: halation and a different effective sensitivity. That is why these emulsions have such a particular look when shot in conventional still cameras. In this sense, last year Kodak announced changes in the production of its motion picture films, including the removal of the remjet layer. Even so, 100 Film and other brands are still selling this type of emulsion, probably because they still have stock or because the transition has not fully materialized in the market yet. In any case, it seems reasonable to think that this product line is going to change in the coming years, although it's still not entirely clear how. And now, the obvious question. If 800 is Kodak Vision 3 500T, is it basically the same thing as Candido 800T? The short answer will be yes, but with some nuances. Compared with the analysis I made of Candido in the previous video, there are visible differences. But the important thing is that the overall pattern remains the same. The hue and saturation shifts clearly point to the same base emulsion. The oranges and yellows show practically identical shifts compared with the reference color. In the greens, we also see similar tendency towards science, although Candido moves a little more strongly in the cooler greens and increases their saturation more. 800, on the other hand, keeps that movement more restrained and overall ends up showing greater color fidelity. So the question is obvious: if the base emulsion is the same, why are the results not identical? To rule out a simple experimental error, I repeated the analysis using a second roll of 800. Both rolls were developed at the same time with the same chemistry, and the results were practically indistinguishable. In other words, the difference between the two 800 rolls are minimal, nothing like the difference observed between 800 and Candido. This leads me to think that the variation is not so much in the original emulsion, but in everything that happens afterwards. Remjet removal, the treatment applied by each company, the state of the material, the production date or storage conditions. With this type of respoon film, we do not always have the same traceability as with a conventional commercial Kodak emulsion, so it is difficult to know with complete certainty. In any case, the conclusion will be this: same recipe, very similar behavior, and a small difference that probably appear along the way. And to close the analysis, where do 400 and 800 sit within the general ranking? In average hue difference, 400 lands in a solid 6th place, just ahead of 100, with an average deviation of 8.4 degrees. This is a fairly contained value and sits within the normal range for most commercial color negative films. 800, on the other hand, noticeably improves on the 21.7 degrees average difference that Candido showed, although because of its tungsten balance, it still ranks among the lowest in terms of hue fidelity. But when we move to average saturation difference, 400 really makes a statement. Second place in the ranking, only behind Ultramax, with an average difference of just 7.9%. 800 also improved slightly compared with Candido, going from 15.8 to 14.4%. It is still a noticeably desaturated film, but nothing dramatic. So, to sum things up, 100 is the most distinctive, the most personal, and probably the most recognizable. 400 is the most balanced and reliable, and 800 is the most atmospheric, the most cinematic, and the one that plays the most with that overall cooling of the thing. And that is it. What do you think? Have you already shot any of these rolls? I hope this video has left you with a good taste in your mouth. We are one step closer to the second part of this project. If you enjoyed it, consider subscribing so you can keep seeing me around here. And remember that the poster from the part 1 of the project is available on my website. Many thanks to the people at 100 Film who provided the material for this analysis. And also a huge thank you to the members of the Inner Circle who make it possible to fund these projects and allow me to keep sharing this content freely and independently. See you soon.